For those of you who don't know me, I am Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at University College London, and I'm also the Academic Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established in memory of the late British historian. As many of you, of course, will know, Sir Martin was the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, and in addition to that, published many dozens of books on a very wide range of topics, including many on modern Jewish history. And the centre was founded a few years ago by Sir Martin's widow and some friends, really to perpetuate two key principles of his work. First was the desire to make history accessible, to bring it alive for audiences outside the ivory tower. And secondly, a commitment to allowing the voices of ordinary people to be heard, not only leaders and politicians who shape world events, but also ordinary men and women who experienced and in many smaller ways also shaped those events. So everything that we do, all of our programming is underpinned by those core principles. In order to reach that wide audience, we try and keep all our events free at the point of access, which means, of course, that we rely on your donations. Thanks so much to those of you who have already generously donated when booking. If you haven't and would like to, it's very easy to do so on our website, and we gratefully receive any of your contributions. So today we are very, very privileged to have with us two distinguished guests, a formidable husband and wife team who have combined their talents to produce this really wonderful, finely grained study. Nomi Stolzenberg. I'm going to get this right, the correct American pronunciation, not the British one. Nomi Stolzenberg holds the Nathan and Lily Chappell Chair at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law, and she is a distinguished scholar in the areas of law and religion. David Myers is Distinguished Professor and Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles. And he, in turn, has published widely in the field of modern Jewish history. And they're going to be talking to us about their recent book, American Shtetl, which was named one of the New Yorker Magazine's best books of 2022. It's a fascinating book in which they paint a rich and dynamic portrait of Kiryas Yoel, which is a Hasidic village in upstate New York. And it's a really interesting story of a community that is on one level radically separate from mainstream American life, and on another level, they argue, quintessentially American. And they will be telling us more about that. So Nomi and David will talk for about 30 minutes. Following that, I will ask them a few questions and we will be open for your comments and questions. Feel free to post your questions directly in the chat. You can send them to me or to everybody, or feel free also to put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question directly. And we're going to aim to finish promptly in less than an hour's time at 8 p.m. UK time. So without any further ado, let me hand over to David and Nomi.
Thank you so much, Shirley. It's so great to be with you. It's so great to see some friends on this Zoom screen. And I must confess, I remember with incredible fondness a Shabbat afternoon in Jerusalem with Sir Martin Gilbert, when he used his formidable powers of storytelling to relate an experience he had recently had with a Chechen warlord who, it turned out, was Jewish. Only he could tell such a tale, and he did it so with breathtaking capacity. We're going to tell a tale about a fascinating community in the United States called Kiryas Yoel, or Kiryas Joel, or KJ. We'll use all of those terms interchangeably. It's a community that, as Shirley said, consists exclusively of members of one Hasidic group, the Sabra Hasidic group. And Nomi and I have been embarked on research into this community, for more than 15 years. And the book that we published is entitled American Shtetl. And our job today is to help explain those terms, American and Shtetl, and why they fit together in our understanding of this community. So with that, I'm going to begin to share my screen. And I'll try to figure out how to. Let's see. 1 second. And figure out how to. No.
Entirely sure, but bear with us for a second.
There we go. Okay, so as some of you may know, the subject of Haredi, which is to say traditionalist or ultra-Orthodox Jews, of whom Hasidic Jews constitute a very substantial part, have been the subject of interest and attention for decades in the United States. But more recently, in fact, since September 11th, 2022, they have been the focus of very intense scrutiny by the New York Times, which has published a series of journalistic inquiries into the funding model of education for Hasidic schools in the New York metropolitan area. What you see before you is the first of these stories, which was a front page piece that actually continued for 4 full pages and galvanized larger public attention in the phenomenon of Haredi and particularly Hasidic groups. We, for our part, have been interested in the phenomenon for several decades, and this indeed was the subject of the aforementioned book, American Shtetl. And as I said, our task is really to explain what's American and what's a Shtetl about the community. So I want to jump right in and explain what we mean by Shtetl. So as some of you may know, Shtetl, which is the diminutive form for the Yiddish word for town or village, was the term applied to large concentrations of Jews as parts of a neighborhood or as a significant majority or plurality for that matter in a larger town, village, or city in Eastern Europe. So the historical Shtetl was a site of considerable Jewish residence within or adjacent to larger non-Jewish populations. As you see on the screen from the quote from Professor Samuel Kassow, it is a mistake to imagine that the Shtetl was completely and unalterably a homogeneous Jewish unit, hermetically sealed off from the rest of the world. That really resembles the mythic ideal of the Shtetl, the ideal of the Shtetl that we may know from Fiddler on the Roof, at least until the beginning of the denouement of that mythic community. So the mythic Shtetl is hermetically sealed, insular, segregated, overwhelmingly Jewish, homogeneous, and at a remove from a larger Jewish world. The historical Shtetl was quite unlike that, adjacent to or part of a larger non-Jewish community and containing a very considerable degree of religious, political, and cultural diversity, heterogeneity. What's also important to note for our story is that Shtetl in Eastern Europe never assumed the form of a self-regulating governmental body. And that's one, but only one of the things that distinguishes the historical Shtetl from the Shtetl we're about to talk about. Because the Shtetl we're about to talk about, Kiryas Joel, a self-described Shtetl, not a term we apply. Indeed, it was the original vision of the founders to create a Shtetl. The original vision was to create exactly that which resembles the mythic ideal of the Shtetl, a place at a remove from the city and all the seductions and allures of a major urban environment, and a completely homogeneous, self-contained enclave society. In this case, the story we tell is a story of astonishing success in creating that mythic ideal of a Shtetl. We're talking about Kiryas Joel, which according to the most recent United States Census has 33,000 residents, almost all of whom are members of the Satmar Hasidic group. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The community lives according to the ways of Satmar Hasidism, and thus is able to maintain a high degree of homogeneity within the self-contained confines of the enclave. What is also important to note, and quite distinct from the Eastern European Shtetl, the Shtetl of Yor, is that this community of Satmar Hasidic Jews has achieved a degree of what we call local sovereignty, which is to say, it is a legally recognized municipality according to the laws of the state of New York. It was and became a village in 1977. And to get a sense of the character, the flavor of the community, you can see on your right this sign, which greets visitors who come to the community, imploring them to adhere to the modesty norms of the community, which is to say, it not only maintains that sense of modesty and propriety within, but it invites, encourages, actively enjoins those who come from outside to adhere to the laws of the community as well. And thus, when you step into the community, you're really stepping into a rather different world in many regards. It's also important to note, for reasons that we will have a chance to discuss, that the village of Kiryas Joel, incorporated in 1977, became a self-standing town, which was a kind of higher order of local government according to the laws of the state of New York in 2019, and goes by the name Palm Tree, which is significant because that's the English translation for the last name of the founding Rebbe of the Satmar Hasidic community, Rabbi Joel or Yoel Teitelbaum, known as Reb Yoelish, who was not just the founder of the Satmar Hasidic group, but the scion of one of the most distinguished and, we might add, combative Hasidic families in one of the most interesting sites of Hasidic settlement in the 19th century, which was Hungary, and particularly the northeast quadrant of Hungary, known as the Hungarian Unterland, Transylvania, where the Teitelbaum family settled from the early 19th century. One of the distinctive features of the Teitelbaum family was its commitment to engage in combat in order to uphold the values of Torah, and that indeed was a quality very much associated with Reb Yoelish, who saw all forms of modern innovation, Reform Judaism, what was known as Neolog Judaism in the Hungarian context, modern Orthodox Judaism as transgressions, and the chief transgression of all, according to his very distinctive view, was Zionism, because it reflected a human impulse to initiate the messianic process, the process of messianic redemption, rather than leaving that right to the divine. This led Reb Yoelish to develop a very controversial theological position regarding Zionism and the Holocaust that he wrote about in a book called Vayal Moshe and other places. But along the way, as he was formulating this very distinctive ideological worldview, he developed a strong coterie of followers in initially Hungary, and then after 1920, after the end of the First World War and the Treaty of Trianon, when Hungary ceded a substantial portion of territory to various successor states in the region, became Romania. And it was indeed in Romania that Reb Yoelish created for the first time the group that would become known as Satmar Hasidim. So the Hungarian town prior to 1920 was Satmar. After 1920, the Romanian town was Satu Mare, which does not mean, as many think, St. Mary, but rather large village. And there, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, relatively late in the day from 1934, began to develop a coterie of followers. He did so over the course of a decade before Nazi Germany invaded Hungary reverted to Hungary after 1940 on March 19th, 1944, and the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community of the region in which Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum established his dynasty was deported and killed. He himself survived in circumstances that require more attention that we may get to in the Q&A. And he made his way after a period of incarceration in Bergen-Belsen to Switzerland for about 9 months, then to Eretz Yisrael, somewhat ironic given his commitment to a radical anti-Zionist agenda, and then on Rosh Hashanah 1946 to the United States, where he began to establish his community. I'll just go back for a second. Establish a community largely based of the tattered fragments of Hungarian survivors who made their way to New York. He himself descended from the ship, and his followers brought him to a neighborhood in Brooklyn known as Williamsburg. And it was there that he began the assiduous work to build up his community anew, indeed, a community that would surpass in size what existed once in East Central Europe. Although he was committed to building up the infrastructure and demographic growth of his community in Brooklyn, he understood immediately that he would also need a place outside of the city as an additional site of refuge for his community. A place that would, as I said earlier, avoid the seductions of the city, and a place that would be more affordable to live in than the city itself. So he entrusted the task to a number of lieutenants of his to find a property in the suburban, rural New York metropolitan area where a satellite community could be established. Many efforts were made over the course of almost a quarter century. It turns out property owners in the suburban New York area were not that keen on having large numbers of Hasidic Jews come into their communities, which is not a uniquely American story, it should be added. And over time, Rebbe Yoelish's advisors sort of got wise, and they found a front man who was not a Satmar Hasidic Jew, a clean-shaven Jew, who was able to purchase land in Orange County, New York, in the town of Monroe in 1972. And their efforts began to build up a community, a neighborhood really, of followers of Rebbe Yoelish. That work of building took place between 1972 and 1974. In the summer of 1974, the first, actually beginning in the spring, but really more significantly in the summer of 1974, the first arrivals make their way. And then it turns out a series of disputes break out between residents of the town of Monroe and the new arrivals, the new Satmar arrivals, largely over zoning regulations. What constitutes a single family home? Is it permissible to have a mikveh, a ritual bath, or a matzah bakery, or a kindergarten in the basement of a garden apartment? These tensions between town officials and residents of Monroe on one hand and the new Satmar arrivals threatened to break out into very serious litigation in 1976. And as a compromise that forestalled litigation, it was decided to allow the Satmar residents of Monroe to carve out their own village within the larger town of Monroe, an act that would afford them the right to regulate their own zoning. So almost overnight, it turns out that a collection of private property owners, Satmar Hasidim who bought in the town of Monroe, were able to create their own Hasidic public square. At that point, now March 1977, the community of Satmar residents became the official village of Kiryas Joel. And just very briefly, I want to sort of outline some of the successes and failures of the community. So since that time, 1977, Kiryas Joel has been a success in many regards, perhaps most importantly in demographic terms. It has grown at an explosive rate, owing not to movement from outside, but internal growth, very large families. And as another measure of success, this is a homogeneous community in which the language on the street and in almost public institutions is Yiddish. This is a cradle-to-grave Yiddish-speaking community that reflects the desired homogeneity that Rebbe Yoelish had in mind. It is a community that takes education very seriously, and there is a very extensive network of educational institutions, but they are, with one important exception, private educational institutions, cheder and yeshivas, intended to impart a heavy dose of religious education. Very few members of the community, in contrast to the larger American Jewish ideal, make their way to university. As we saw in the sign on the top right, modesty norms in the community are upheld. And then finally, Another measure of success is the extent to which this community controls its own affairs, both the religious congregation and the larger municipality, which are not identical, but intersect at many points. And yet, all is not well within the community. And the trouble really begins with the death of Rebbe Eilish in 1979. He left no heirs behind him. His three daughters predeceased him. Sort of the most obvious person to succeed him was someone whom his wife, the Rebbitzin, known as Alta Feiga, detested. And it was that person who became the next Satmar Rebbe, Reb Moshe Teitelbaum, his nephew, which commenced a series of fractious disagreements, initially between Rabbi Moshe and those who surrounded the Rebbitzin, who became, in a certain sense, the first group of dissidents. And then, much more famously, after 1999, when Reb Moshe decided to divide the Satmar Empire between its two major geographic locations, Williamsburg and Kiryas Joel. It was long assumed that his eldest son would inherit the entire empire, but in 1999, he decided to divide it and give part to his oldest son and part to his third son, all of which means that there have been really fractious divisions and disagreements within the Satmar world since 1979. There have also been many, many tensions with the surrounding world, especially neighbors of Kiryas Joel in Orange County, over two vital natural resources, which is to say land and water. I want to say just a final thought. Kiryas Joel is similar to and yet different from other concentrations of Hasidic or Haredi Jews around the world. Here in the top left, we say Bnei Brak, which is marked by a diversity of Haredi life that we do not see in Kiryas Joel. Bottom left, we see Kiryas Tosh, a community, small community of Hasidic Jews in Quebec, who do not constitute a legally recognized municipality. And of course, familiar to you in the UK, Canvey Island, which is host to a group of Satmar Hasidic Jews who do not yet possess the rights of local government. So these are points of difference. What is interesting, and with this I'll conclude and hand things over to Nomi, Kiryas Joel actually does fit into the landscape of the United States and its tradition of support for strong forms of religious subcommunity extending back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony up through what is arguably the most successful form of what we call religious communitarianism in the United States, which is to say the state of Utah, and up to other late 20th century examples. But it's precisely at this point that I'm going to hand things over to Nomi.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to try to expand on the last points that David made and say a little bit more about what we think is distinctively American about the village of Kiryas Joel. And we're very committed to that proposition, which flies in the face of both the perception of many outsiders who perceive the community's very existence to be a violation of the fundamental principles embodied in the American Constitution, in particular, principle of separation between church and state, the ideal of integration, and the community's own commitment to resisting assimilation into the surrounding, that is to say, American culture. Nonetheless, that's our line and we're sticking to it. We do think there is something deeply American. That said, what is American about the community is not so easy to specify. And that's for two different reasons. One is there are many different aspects of the community that resonate with the many different aspects of American society. We might point, as David has just done, to the long tradition of religious experimentation, religious pluralism, and religious enclaves, and simply the oft observed high level of religiosity in American society. We might point to the Satmar's very quick learning and then indeed mastering of American style democratic politics, interest group politics. We might point to the very interesting episode, which turned out to play a really outsized role in the community's development, which is to say the rise of a disability rights consciousness, and we might even say movement inside the community. Most obviously, we might point to the influence of the internet. All of these things are aspects of the Americanness of Curious Joel. Yet another thing, which I'm going to expand upon in the rest of my comments, is the outsized influence of law, of American law, of this community's resort to American courts, notwithstanding the members' professed adherence to a principle of Jewish law that internal disputes should never be brought to Gentile, that is to say, secular civil courts. So that's one reason why the answer to the question of what is American about Curious Joel is complex. There are many different things. But the second reason why it's not so easy to specify what precisely is so American about Curious Joel is because there are many competing views about what is American, right? Not just what's American about Curious Joel, but what is American. There are many different schools of thought, many different ways of interpreting the principles embodied in the American Constitution. And to, give an oversimplified description of those schools of thought, but these are sort of three camps whose coexistence and competition in the period of time in which Curious Joel was being formed really framed the community's development. We begin with what in the 1970s, when Curious Joel was being born, was still then the dominant school of thought about what does America stand for. So dominant was it. This seems like ancient history today, but when we were growing up, it was still commonplace to refer to a sort of 20th century liberal vision as the American consensus, not just the liberal consensus, but the American consensus. The idea that the aforementioned principles of separation of church and state and integration, an ideal that was, of course, forged above all in the civil rights movement, that these were the quintessential values. This expresses the quintessential meaning of the American Constitution. But that was always being challenged by opponents of liberalism, by conservatism, American style, which includes both economic wings and religious conservatism of the sort that has come to be known as the religious right, which disputed both the principle of separation between church and state and the principle of integration in favor of a return, a restoration of the traditional public role of religion, and as against the integrationist ideal in favor of the right of communities of people to be able to separate themselves from one another, whether on racial lines or religious lines or lines of class, and live with their own kind. So that's the second school of thought about what is American. But it was not only conservatism that posed this challenge to the so-called consensus ideals of integrationism and separation of church and state. Liberalism, at the time that Curious Joel was being formed in the 70s and 80s, was also being subjected to critiques from the left, who likewise championed ideas of group empowerment. Whether we're talking about more liberal or left-wing versions of communitarianism, multiculturalism, or even more radical separatist movements. So that's a general framing. What I want to do in the remainder of our remarks before we open up for questions is to say a little bit more about the role of American law in the formation of the community and in the engendering of its American character. Now, oftentimes when people think about the law, they tend to think about what we call public law. That is to say, the law that governs public institutions, governmental entities, federal, state, and local governments, but also the law that governs even privately owned entities, but that are deemed to be public in some broader sense, what we call places of public accommodation. That is to say, we think of, in America, of constitutional law or civil rights laws, statutes, other species of statutory law that govern the exercise of power by public institutions. And we think about how those laws are invoked in the context of courtroom battles. And that dimension of law, public law, has played a pretty significant role in developments in Curious Joel. But what I want to call attention to and emphasize in these remarks is the less visible, but in some ways arguably more significant and maybe more archetypically American role played by what we call private law, in contradistinction to public law. What's private law? It's the law that governs the activities of private actors and private activities. In particular, private property law, the various bodies of law that govern the conduct of real estate transactions, the law that governs private corporations, both for-profit economic corporations and nonprofit corporations, the law of the family. All of that is denominated private law, at least in the American system. It too can become the subject of courtroom battles, but it plays an even more powerful role, albeit largely invisible role, outside the context of litigation. Why is that so important? Well, here I want to revisit the slide David shared with you earlier, where he talked about the transition. You might even think of it as the pathway from private to public that was followed by the Satmars. Private law plays two distinct, albeit interrelated roles in the formation, in the history of the village. First, it literally enabled the creation of the village. As David spoke about earlier, the community begins as purely a private institution, and an association, an informal association of private property owners clustered together in the town of Curious Joel. And it was only by establishing themselves in that private role that they were then able to transform themselves into an officially recognized, legally recognized municipal incorporation. Private law, American style, enabled the Satmars to do that. Second, private law and America's commitment to observing a distinction between public and private entities has served to defend the village from various attacks on the constitutionality of its public municipal institutions by, as it were, alibying their secular character. So let me try to explain how that works in a little bit more detail with a somewhat crazy slide that, if I had more technical savvy, which I hope to acquire, this would be animated. If this slide were animated, we would begin with it being entirely blank, but for the pre-existing public entities of the town of Monroe and the existing regional public school district, the Monroe-Woodbury School District, that embraced both the town of Monroe and the neighboring town of Woodbury. Everything else would be empty at the beginning of the Satmar story. And the first thing that would then appear on the screen is this big circle on the left-hand side, the development company, right? This is a company owned by prominent business leaders, members of the Satmar community, who essentially bankrolled and continue to bankroll the community. The development company acquires all of this originally undeveloped area of land in the town of Monroe, and it does what development companies do. It develops the land, it subdivides it, and then it sells it off to, here, if you look at the bottom, every little square with an O is an owner who buys the property from the development company, or the R's are renters. Some are single family homes. There are many multifamily homes for obvious reasons, owing to large family size and low income. There's a preference for a sort of high density style of housing associated more commonly in America with urban, as opposed to this kind of suburban / rural community, which is precisely what causes so much friction with the residents of the other parts of the town. The development company is also responsible for acquiring the land and then building the building that houses the synagogue. So we see the synagogue, which is officially incorporated under the state of New York's private religious corporation law. Likewise, the private schools in the United States of America, religious schools have to be private. The cemetery, these are all private property entities, privately owned entities, controlled by the religious leaders and the lay leaders of the community. We also see the formation of committees. Again, these are private. Everything in blue is private. Spin-offs of the congregation. We have the Modesty Committee, a group of Satmar men, all the officially recognized leaders are men, who perform the function of enforcing the so-called modesty norms, which are largely norms of dress and behavior that reflect a traditional division of gender roles and traditional sexual mores. This large circle here, the Vad HaKiriyah, that literally means the town committee, is essentially indistinguishable from the development company. It is a nominally private committee, as it were, but whose job is to engage in what we might call city planning, to plan, to acquire, and to plan for the allocation of residential property. All of that pre-exists the existence of any of the community's municipal entities which exist above the line. But by virtue of settling, by becoming private property owners and renters in sufficient number, which we recall, it doesn't take many, only 500, they are able to vote themselves into municipal incorporation. So then, and only then, right, do we see the establishment of the public entities, which includes the village board of trustees. That's basically like a town council, a mayor, a deputy mayor. It has various agencies such as the building department. There's also a federal local agency, a public housing authority. Eventually, the community is able to establish its own public school district, separate from the Monroe Woodbury School District. All of these entities are public, are from the standpoint of American law, separate and distinct from the private entities, but although from the standpoint of American law, there's a clear dividing line between the blue, the public, and the orange, yellow, and green, the private and the public entities, there's de facto, in reality, a great blurring of the line. How so? First of all, personnel. The mayor, the deputy mayor, a character named Abe Weeder, also serves alternately as the president or vice president of the segregation of the congregation, the head of the development company, which really is the main engine of virtually everything occurring, also becomes the head of the Vad HaKirya. As I say, these are essentially interchangeable entity. And then he becomes the head of the building department, and also is appointed to sit on the public housing authority. So the same people wear different hats, public and private hats, effectively blurring the boundary line between public and private, and therefore, likewise, secular and religious entities and spheres of authority. So the question that raises, and we really only have time to raise it as a question here, and then we're happy to take your questions and comments and amplify on this further, is whether the legally private character of Kiryas Joel's private institutions serves, either from a legal point of view or from your own personal, moral, or political point of view, to insulate it from the various accusations that have been leveled against the village, right? Which include the accusation that the village, the way the village operates, and indeed its very existence, violates the separation of church and state, and or that it is discriminating by excluding non-Satmars, by maintaining a completely religiously homogeneous population, or that it operates in a discriminatory fashion and or a coercive fashion within the boundaries by, in effect, enforcing the community's religious customs and laws. The village defends itself from those accusations by saying none of that exclusion or coercion is actually performed by the village's public entities. That's all being done by the community's private institutions. And that is a view that on certainly the conservative view would uphold. Here I'm referring and ending with a reminder of these three different broad visions of what Americanism is. On the conservative view, the community's secular institutions, legal institutions, are secular in character, and the fact that there are private institutions that are enforcing religious law and excluding non-Satmars is perfectly in comportment with the American Constitution. That's in diametric opposition to the view that many mainstream liberals hold. And I will just end by saying that the left-wing critique of liberalism is, shall we say, deeply ambivalent with respect to this question. And it's precisely because this, the Satmars' pursuit, their very successful pursuit of the creation of their own village, takes place in a time period in which the 20th century version of liberalism is under sustained attack from both the right and the left. That created a climate that was exceedingly hospitable to the Satmars venture.
Thank you so much, Nomi and David, for a really fascinating overview. I mean, the story of Kiryas Joel itself is so interesting, and you raise around it a series of really complex and rich questions, which you develop in your wonderful book, and which we have a little bit of time to explore a bit further now. I'm going to start off, before we even jump into questions around the content itself. I wonder if you can just quickly say something about your own personal positions in the project, particularly how, as two non-Haredi Jews, you went about researching this community and how that was received.
Yeah, we'll go first.
Well, the first thing to say is, we had to make very clear what we were going to deliver on and what we weren't, given that, as I said to you, Shirley, and before we started, Curaçao is like a Rorschach test for people. It sort of positions their own sense of self, and often Jewish self, their attitude towards the place. And we knew that there were many people who saw it as sort of the instantiation of sort of the complete breakdown of the vaunted American separation of church and state, and as a theocracy that was an outrage to the system, and that there were many people who saw it as, I often heard within the community, the most beautiful form of life known to humankind. So the first thing to say is we developed this stance that we come neither to condemn nor to condone. Now, I've spent a lot of my time as an intellectual historian talking about the inherent subjectivity of the historian's task, and sort of now understanding, what it's like to be a kind of ethnographer, as I had to be for this task. I adopted a kind of a different disposition. I think what we aim to do is to treat this community with both a measure of empathy and critical distance, like strike a note between those two poles. In doing so, it's important to note that Nomi and I did not have identical stances ourselves towards the community. If there is a spectrum that extends from liberalism, individualist liberalism on one hand, to what's called communitarianism on the other, to sort of an appreciation for collective life in small groups in particular, one of us tends slightly more to the communitarian side of the spectrum, and one of us more to the individual liberal side of the spectrum. So in addition to trying to navigate between the haters and the promoters of the community, we also had to navigate our own different subject positions, which was very interesting. I should just say before handing over to Nomi that, we didn't know what to expect when we, or I in this case, made our way to KJ. I sent a letter to the community and asked if I could come and undertake research, received an answer back rather quickly thereafter saying, yes, please do come. And when I got there, was shocked for the first of many, many times when I was told, we're actually interested in someone from the outside coming and giving us an impression of what we look like from the outside. That was already the first indication that this was something, the language was something American. We want to sort of make sure we understand the world around us, and to do so, we have to understand how we're perceived. We want to be accountable to our neighbors. It was really quite stunning. And from that moment, I had very, very good access to people in the community. And I would just say that almost all of my interactions with people in the community were positive. I had very few negative interactions where people were violently opposed to my presence or simply didn't want to engage. Those who agreed to talk to me, and amply so. And so I think it helped develop and deepen that sense of empathy as someone who does not come from the Haredi community.
Yeah, so I would maybe restate David's formulation: we come neither to condemn nor to condone. For me, my version of that is maybe we come neither to condemn nor to condone, but we do come to critique, right? Which is different from condemnation, critique. So that's what, but then the other thing is, what is the object of critique? For me, it was the utmost importance that insofar as there is some kind of critique, there is a critical perspective, albeit one that I think is, I hope, a very sympathetic. We really try to understand the community and the many different elements of the community and the many different cultures represented by people who engage with the community from the outside. That, and this goes to the title of the book, what we are describing here is not just this little insular, strange community. This is a book about America. So for me, I come to it where my primary interest, what it is that I want to subject to critique actually is America, right? The political visions that I made reference to in my remarks. And for me, that includes both the conservative American political tradition. I think it's important to subject that to critique, and a big part of the book is about the rise of the religious right, and how that created a very hospitable environment. But my entire career, have been very drawn to critiques of liberalism. And here I'll just finish by saying, I think we're inviting us to talk about sort of our personal background. Both David and I grew up in families that in some ways on the spectrum of different forms of modern Jewish identity, you might say are very similar, liberal, using this term loosely because it's a complex term, liberal secular Jewish families on the Northeast. I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was born in 1961. Cambridge, Massachusetts, home of Harvard. It's in the 60s and 70s. This is like the epicenter of American liberalism, which was deeply formative for me. But I also, as growing up in a completely secular Jewish family, there was something mystifying about it, as particularly its creed of race, creed, or color doesn't matter, and yet the assimilationism of that integrationist vision, something about that wasn't quite right, and so too something about secularism seemed to be worthy of critique. And I think those questions I had as a child growing up about liberalism and secularism are a big part of what motivated my interest in the subject.
Thank you. So I have a range of further questions myself, but I'm going to pause those to pose just a few questions that have come through in the chat, and I'll ask them together. I'll just read them out. Yeah. Though you can see them in the chat, which are more kind of information-focused questions. The first from John Benjamin, one of our trustees, who asks, is the private-public debate impacted by the provision of public services like garbage collection, policing, and so on? Melissa asks whether if a child inherits a house and decides not to presumably remain within the sub community, how that affects their ability to continue engaging in that community. And finally, a question of whether the ultra-Orthodox community in Monsey is near Kiryas Yoel.
Maybe I'll take the first two questions and then kick it over to David to talk about Monsey. Because the first two questions, I think, are two sides of this public-private distinction coin. In the village, the main thing that the village does, and it would say in defense of its secular character, that these are really the only kinds of things it does, is it performs typical municipal services like garbage collection. There is a fire department. There is not a village police department. There's reliance instead, on the one hand, on the state police that have a building literally at the entrance of the community. They're part of that jurisdiction. There's also private security forces. So here we're starting to see some of the blurring of the boundary. But for the most part, right, the village, there are no official laws. There are no village ordinances enforcing religious laws. There are no municipal laws that say you have to be Satmar, or you have to be Jewish, or you have to engage in any form of religious observance to be allowed to live in the village. So the direct answer to the question, if a child inherits a house, or if anybody, and indeed there are quite a number of people in the community, a small percentage, but very interesting phenomenon of people who stay in the village, but no longer believe, there's certainly no law, there's no municipal ordinance that would defeat their ownership rights. You own, now, there may be a lot of social pressures, and but the social pressures are technically all emanating from the realm of private activity. So then the question becomes, do you consider the enforcement of private rights that enable private actors and private institutions like the congregation or the modesty committee to apply social pressure to people who don't abide by the community's social norms? Is that a form of state action? Is that a public, those rights are enforced by courts, but they are private rights?
I'll just comment briefly on John's follow-up regarding what we call sewage, which is the third most important natural resource in suburban New York. It all comes down to land, water, and sewage usage. Tremendous competition over sewage facilities and who can use them, which is the ultimate regulator of population density in suburban New York. To get to, I guess it's Saul's question, yes, Monsey is about 17 miles from Kiryas Joel. It takes about 25 minutes to get there. It represents in many respects a different model. Monsey is much more diverse. It is not simply a community of Kiryas Joel. Some people who want to have a kind of more open lifestyle no longer under the gaze of the Vadat Tznius, the modesty committee, moved to Monsey. That's kind of a first step out, not towards going off the derech to a non-observant life, but to a less scrupulously observant Satmar style life, still a traditionalist Orthodox. It's interesting to note that Monsey is a hamlet in the town of Ramapo, New York. Ramapo has within it two villages, Keser and New Square, which are comprised almost exclusively of Hasidic Jews as well. One of which is the precursor to Kiryas Joel, namely New Square, established in 1961, and Keser, established in the 1990s. So we have in the suburban New York area at least three examples of self-standing Hasidic municipalities. There's another important distinction that I want to draw between Ramapo and Kiryas Joel. They represent, putting Keser and New Square aside, Ramapo and Monsey have very large concentrations of traditionally observant Orthodox Jews. What has happened in Ramapo is that Orthodox Jews have taken control, especially of the public school board, the state-run school system, and some would say unfairly diverted resources to the private, which is to say the religious school system. And people often confuse what went down in East Ramapo, at the East Ramapo School District, with what happens in Kiryas Joel. But that's not the case, because what happened in Kiryas Joel is really sort of without precedent in the history of traditionalist Orthodox life in the United States and the relationship to state authority. What happened in Kiryas Joel was that a solution was hatched after several failed attempts to create a state school for Hasidic kids in the Shtetl itself, in Kiryas Joel. That is, which kids? Children with special needs, because it was believed that the private school system could not accommodate their needs, and it was extremely expensive. And rather than have special needs children go to go to a school district outside of Kiryas Joel, as was attempted, and as was perceived a great failure, it was decided in the late 1980s to establish a self-standing state school in Kiryas Joel, a very different model than East Ramapo, where
But not a religious school.
not a religious school, a public school, which takes off for Jewish holidays, but whose instruction does not have religious content to it. That became the source of perhaps the greatest notoriety for Kiryas Joel, when the legality of that public school, state school, I suppose in your terms, was debated by the United States Supreme Court in 1994. And to find out more details about that, and in fact, in infinite detail, you should purchase a copy of American Shtetl, or at least take a look at it in whatever way you can.
Well, on that note, I have just reposted the link if you would like to get a 30% discount on the book from Princeton's website. So please do go ahead and do that. And I'm going to resist the temptation to exploit my position as chair to ask you some of my other questions, of which there are very many. There is so much in this book and in the study, and particularly where this story sits in that much longer Jewish history of Jews learning to master the political landscape in which they live. This is the American one, but there's of course a much longer history. But as I say, I will not ask that question. I will just thank you once again so much on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center for taking of your time to come and talk with us today. And just a reminder about our next upcoming event, which is going to be next Monday, the 23rd of January. We have Professor Sue Grazel coming to talk with us about the age of the gas mask, how British civilians faced the terrors of total war. So please do register to book your place. Hopefully we will see some of you again very soon. Thank you so much again, Nomi and David.
Thank you.
Always great to see you, Shirley.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.